Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue the study through the Gospels, looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. We're doing this chronologically. We're going through these in order as they happen, as best as we can tell they happen. And so today we're still in this process in John 7, 8, where Jesus is in the temple speaking to some of his followers, some people coming to listen to him, and the religious leaders who, question him, trying to trick him. We've seen that over the last couple of days. And so today Jesus is speaking about God's true children, who his true followers are. And I'm not going to go over this one in detail for you, just because it is a longer section of scripture. But basically, what Jesus starts out with in verse 31 is that, those who believe in him, he says this to those, you are truly my disciples, if you remain faithful to my teachings, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You've probably heard that before. And so they claim to be descendants of Abraham, right? And there's like, we're not slaves to anyone, and and he's like, and so they claim this, and he's like, hey, I tell you the truth, if you're in sin, right, you're a slave to sin. We're all slaves to sin. And so, and they keep declaring, well, our father's Abraham. He's like, no, your father's not Abraham, because if your father was Abraham, you would mimic him, you would have the faith of him, and you would follow me. And so he basically kind of calls them illegitimate children, which is a huge insult to them, because that was their pride and joy of being, descendants of Abraham. And so in the end, he basically tells them that they're followers of Satan, and that they're not, that they're the sons of Satan, not the sons of Abraham, and descendants of Abraham, which would have been obviously an insult to anyone, but a horrible insult to them. And so he basically finished saying, with anyone who belongs to God listens gladly to the words of God, but you don't listen because you don't belong to God. So he's sitting there telling them, you do not belong to God in this conversation. Then we'll see their reaction tomorrow. But as Jesus was talking about all this, right, we see, and go back and read this, and some of these notes and stuff that we cover will make a little bit more sense. Again, I just don't have the time to read it all and cover every single part of these details in this section. But the one thing we have to realize is sin does have a way of enslaving us. It controls us, it can dominate us, and it dictates our action. If you've ever been addicted to anything or struggled with a particular sin, you know that, right? You've seen that, or you've witnessed it in someone else, and Jesus can free us from this, right? And now it may not be the fact that it's, oh, I went to Jesus and now I no longer struggle with this, or not that kind of thing, but he frees us from the consequences of these sins for sure. But it allows us to, when we start following Jesus, it allows us to become the person that God created us to be. And again, it doesn't mean that we're no longer going to struggle with sin or have struggled with the sins. It's, we now have the power to overcome these sins. And in the end, these sins are forgiven. We're no longer slaves to them because they've been forgiven. And so if sin is enslaving you, mastering you, right, controlling you, Jesus can break you out of that. And again, like I said, it doesn't mean like, all of a sudden I put my faith in Jesus and now all of a sudden I don't struggle with sins anymore. That's not going to be the case. In fact, a lot of times the devil's going to come after you harder, and some of this stuff's going to be even harder to deal with. And so, but we have to understand that it's the freeing, that Jesus frees us from the consequences of these sins as long as we continue to follow him. And when I say consequences, right, that doesn't always, if sometimes sinfulness, you're going to reap that while you're here. And so when I say consequences of that sin, I mean going to hell. And so he's freed us from that. He's forgiven us of those. And so we don't have to worry about that as long as we continue in him. And so Jesus then in this message starts to distinguish between illegitimate children and true children, especially his of God. And because the religious leaders were descendants of Abraham, right, the founder of the Jewish nation, they claimed to be children of God because, well, we're Abraham's descendants. But their actions showed that they were truly descendants of Satan, for they lived under Satan. The way they treated people, the way they lived under Satan's guidance. And true followers of Abraham, faithful followers of God, would not act as they did. Right, and we see the continue. They're plotting murders. They're trying to trick God. They're using power, money, and authority to rule over people in a horrible way. And so Jesus calls them out and says, look, true members of Abraham would not act like this. They would not behave this way. And so one of the things we have to remember, right, because I think sometimes we can get caught up, your church membership, right, just because you belong to a particular church, your family connections in a church, right? Well, my great grandfather, my father, and all this. You could come from a line of preachers, you could come from whatever. They don't make you a true child of God. Just because you walk into a church building and claim to be a Christian doesn't make you a true child of God, right? Just because you're part of a particular denomination or group doesn't make you a true child of God, right? Your true father is the one you imitate and obey. And that for us is God and Jesus. That is who we are to be. And the religious leaders, they were unable to understand this. They refused to listen. They refused to listen to anything that Jesus says. And we get caught up in that, right? We refuse. We get so caught up in a lot of times our own traditions or our own teachings that we refuse to listen to anything else, right? And to maybe even look at the fact that maybe we're wrong, right? And this is one of the things I've always tried to, right? I tried. I'm not say always. I've recently tried to start doing, and it's helped me grow a lot in my faith, my spirituality, my closeness to God. Because before I had a strict set of beliefs, and I believed these things no matter what, and I wouldn't even allow them to be questioned. This is what This is it. This is what the Bible says, 100% for sure. I know this, and then when you start truly diving into it and studying a little bit more, it's like, oh, maybe I was wrong here, right? Or maybe I need to look at this closely, or maybe I need to dive a little bit deeper into this, And one of the things that I was guilty of, and a lot of people are, is what's called proof texting. It's like you read one verse. And it's like you take that verse out of context from the rest of the text, right? Or and try to use that as proof to prove your point. And then it doesn't line up with the whole Bible. And so when you start doing stuff like that, right? And this is what a lot of what the Pharisees did. And then the other thing we do is we create our traditions, right? And it's because, well, we've always done this, or we've done this for the last 150 years. So it's no longer a tradition, it's gospel, right? It's, if you don't do this, you're sinning. It's like, well, no, you really can't find that anywhere in the Bible. It's, we've done this for so long that we think it's gospel. And so we've got to make sure that we don't get caught up in those type of things. And again, I've said this in the past, and not that traditions are bad, right? There's a lot of traditions that I think are really, really good. But it's when we make those traditions gospel and salvation issues, right? If we start telling people like, oh, if you don't do this, then you're going to hell, then you've really started to go off the deep end, and we got to be careful with that. And so Satan used the stubbornness and pride and prejudices to keep these people from believing in Jesus. And we need to make sure we don't get that, right? Don't get so stubborn and prideful that you're not willing to admit that maybe you're wrong, or to even question or look at things and dive deeper into things to see if you could be wrong, right? And so we see in a number of places here where Jesus intentionally challenged his listeners to test him. It's like, test him, right? He welcomed those who had questions. And this is something we have to be mindful of and careful of. It's right. A lot of times in the church, we don't welcome questions, or we don't welcome hard questions, or we set up questions in a way where there can't be really discussions. It's, hey, you're allowed to ask this question, but I'm not going to give you a chance to respond, or I'm just going to tell you what it means. That's not how this should work. It should be a discussion. It should be a back and forth. And so Jesus invited this. And so we should invite this, right? We should be secure enough in our faith and strong enough in our faith or our beliefs that we're open to discussions and people asking questions and admitting, like, right, for example, one of my favorite things is if someone asks you a question you don't know, don't try to make something up. Just say, look, I don't know. I do not know. I have no idea. But let's sit down and study this together, and we'll dive deeper into it. And so we need to be open to allowing questions, allowing people to ask questions, and especially in Christianity, and then working to answer those questions together, and not be a sit up there. This is the question. This is the answer. No response. You have to believe what I say. That's not. We're not Jesus, so we need to make sure we don't behave that way, because even Jesus didn't do that. He allowed questions. He allowed discussions. There was a lot of discussion that we see here. And so he welcomed those who wanted to question his claims and character, as long as, and here's the thing, they were willing to follow through on what they discovered. And so we have to be able to make sure that we do that, right? If we see something and it goes against something that we've believed all of our lives, or something we thought, and then we're not willing to accept it just because, well, either what, pride, ego, like the Pharisees here that got in the way of, well, I have to admit that I've been wrong with this, or maybe, and I think this gets harder. It's like, oh, well, maybe I have to admit that maybe my grandfather was wrong about this, or someone who was a guy or someone who taught me was wrong about this, or maybe this wasn't. And that can be hard sometimes, but we have to be able to willing to let that kind of stuff go and just accept Jesus and accept the message that's there. And so Jesus challenges, like his challenge, right, exposes the most frequent reasons why people won't believe him. One, they never accept his challenge to test him. There's a lot of people who never accept that challenge. There's a lot of people who do, and when they sit down and truly study and are open and honest, then they a lot of man, many of them convert, or they test him but are not willing to believe what they discover. There's a lot of people who they read about Jesus, they look into Jesus, and in the end, it's like, yeah, I've heard people say I can't really argue with this, but I just don't believe it, and that's painful to watch and see. And so the question is, have you made these mistakes? Have you been like the Pharisees who, you're stubborn, you're not going to change your thoughts, you're not going to change your mind on anything, or are you like a true follower of Jesus who we're gonna be open to what he says. We're gonna listen to what Jesus says. Maybe it goes against some of the things that I was taught, or some of the traditions that I believe in, but I can see that this is the truth, and so I'm going to accept it since it is the truth. And so that can be hard. I mean, it was hard for me, and it's still hard for me. There's times where, you know, I try to make sure that I'm just continually trying to discover new things, and make sure I'm walking the way I should be walking, and just teaching the things that I should be teaching. I mean, I'll tell you, there's things I taught 5 years ago that I wouldn't teach now, and I wonder if 5 years from now, if there's things I've been teaching today, or this year, that maybe I wouldn't teach. And so we're never going to have all the answers. We don't. I mean, we're just never going to have all the answers, because there's a lot that the Bible and the way the Word of God is this continual learning process, and there's some things we just don't know. Like there's best guesses, right? There's some we can see where maybe this was going. There's some things that are 100% factual that we most of us as Christians agree on, and we're not going to deviate from. But there's a lot of other things that are hard, and so the one thing I want to make sure we focus on is through this whole message here is that true followers of God follow him. They're opening to listening to him, and they live lives that reflect him. And that's the main thing, right? The Pharisees claimed to be followers of God, but they did not reflect, right, the image of God. They did not act the way God wanted them to act. And we need to make sure that we are reflecting Jesus. We talked about Jesus being the light of the world a couple days ago. We need to make sure we are reflecting that light and being the true light of Jesus who we're supposed to be. As always, I appreciate everyone for watching these. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please go ahead and do so. We're going to try to continue to put out a daily, if not daily, but at least weekly, bi-daily, message diving a little bit deeper once we get through the Gospels. As always, I appreciate everyone for watching.